So you decided to cut up your Monstera, or maybe you received a cutting from a friend, you have it propagating in water, maybe in sphagnum moss. Now you're ready to pot it in the mixture. How do you go about it? Let's find out. Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be potting up or transferring a few of our Monstera cuttings into a potting mixture or a substrate depending on the stage they're at right now. So I got about 3 different types of Monsteras here. I got a Monstera Albo that is rooting in water for a while, a Monstera Peru that is also rooting in water, and a Monstera Siltepecana that is rooting in sphagnum moss. So what I want to do is go through each of these plants, give a bit of background on how they came to be, what I want to plant them in, and the reason why I want to do that. I'm also going to share with you guys a bit of how I care for them once you kind of transfer them into a potting mixture. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll start with the Monstera Peru. When I first got these guys, they were potted up in soil mixture. I actually had 2 of these plants, and then during the summer, I decided to repot them because I wanted them to be together, and I made a mistake of potting them into a bigger size of a pot that they needed. In addition, the potting mix I used wasn't airy enough. It was a bit heavy. I eventually overwatered, and of course you experience root rot, the leaves started to fall. So at that point I had to remove it from the soil mixture and put it in water to try and redevelop the roots. The only leaf that was left on these 2 vines were this one that you guys see here. All of these are new growth that you are now seeing since I put it in water. It took a bit of time, but it is bouncing back. This one's amazing because you can see this beautiful new leaf. It's a bit more of a wider form, and then we got this new one. This actually grew naturally, while these growth points that you guys see on this vine, I actually put a bit of cloning paste to kind of help push it through, and so far it's doing well. So what I want to do with this Monstera Peru is I actually want to pot it up in sphagnum moss, not in a potting mixture yet, and that's because the roots that you guys see here are still fairly small and still fairly thin. There's only a few white roots I'm seeing here. Those are kind of the new roots that's developed, so I do want to try and make sure that these roots continue to develop a bit more, and you know, they're not ready to be potted in a aroid mixture like you guys see here. So for now I'm going to use some sphagnum moss, and again, you know, sphagnum moss will do a couple things. It will transition it from obviously getting used to rooting in water to a bit more of a substrate that has a bit of structure, so that way the roots can kind of, you know, latch on and develop. Because the one thing you kind of keep in mind is when you are rooting a plant in water, the roots are going to develop slightly differently than if you were to root them in a potting mixture or a much more thicker substrate, right? So I don't want these guys to get used to sitting in water for long periods of time. Eventually it'll be very difficult for them to transition from, you know, water to a aroid mix or a potting mixture, right? So what I want to do is gradually kind of get them used to that. So that is why I'm going to use a sphagnum moss for this one first. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to use a plastic container here that is not too big. We're going to use about a 4.5 inch, and this also has a lot of drainage holes, which is great because you still want to make sure that this plant receives a lot of oxygen in the root system. So that is one of the reasons why I also want to use sphagnum moss. It's a bit airy, it's light, and also a plastic container that has a lot of drainage holes as well. So we're gonna put some sphagnum moss here first, just add like a nice layer. Now this sphagnum moss is a bit moist, it's not wet. I did miss it a bit, and now what I want to do is place my cuttings, space them out accordingly the way you want to, and then from there you want to just, you know, lightly top it up with some sphagnum moss. One thing to keep in mind when potting your plant in sphagnum moss is, even though this is a nice light and airy substrate that still retains moisture and water, you don't want to pack it in too tightly because it can still suffocate the roots. So that is why I'm just doing this very, very lightly. And yeah, so that is what we're gonna do. And then once I do that, I'm actually not gonna water this plant. Instead, I'm just gonna mist this guy to just, you know, create a bit more of that moisture, because like I said, the sphagnum moss was already a bit moist to begin with, so there's no need to water this guy. So that is pretty much how I go about potting this Monstera Peru. And really at this point, you just want to place this guy in an area where you once had it when it was rooting in water, bright indirect light, warm temperature, and you want to just keep an eye to make sure that this sphagnum moss doesn't dry out completely. You know, if it is starting to dry out, then you do obviously want to water it, and you can water this thoroughly and watch that water drain through it, and that's because it was used to being in water. In addition, the sphagnum moss has a bit of spacing, plus this plastic container has a lot of these drainage holes, so so there's going to be a lot of airflow where you're not going to be able to drown or suffocate this plant, and it's going to experience some root rot because it's not going to be sitting in still water and packed in a very tight substrate or a medium. So for the most part, we just want to make sure that those roots are going to continue to grow and develop inside the sphagnum moss, inside this container, to a point where we can transfer them to a much more kind of like tropical mix or aroid mix, which is what we're going to use for the Siltepecana and the Monstera Albo here. So yeah, there you guys have it. Now we'll do the Siltepecana. So the Siltepecana, when I first got this cutting, was actually already in sphagnum moss, and it was growing beautiful roots, and this thing grows really fast. It's actually one of my favorite new plants that I have. And what we're gonna do with this one is we're actually gonna move this to an aroid mix that you guys see here. This consists of peat chunks, cocoa husk or cocoa chips, bark, and pebble clay. So really airy, plus it has the nutrients from the peat chunks. A very good tropical mix. This is actually what I use now for my philodendrons. A lot more of my uncommon philodendrons are quite sensitive to watering. So that is what we're gonna move our Siltepecana into. And you're probably wondering, how do you know it's ready to move up there? I'm gonna remove this pot out of the sphagnum moss so we can check the roots, and then I'll show you guys what we're gonna do next. So I'm just gonna gently tight on this. Again, this was not packed heavily, so you can easily remove it. And you guys can see right there are some beautiful roots that I see right now, a lot of white. And there are some sphagnum moss, obviously, that's attached to the roots. You can, gently kind of tug on them to try and remove it, but I wouldn't be so concerned if they're attached to it pretty good, because you are going to still pot it in this aroid mixture. Still very airy, so I'm not too worried that it's gonna suffocate. But yeah, so the roots may not be as big right now, but for a cutting this size, it's growing quite a bit, because when I first got this, maybe a month ago, it only had 3 leaves, and it had like 2 aerial roots right there, and since then look how much it's grown, and 2 new leaves since I got it. So really exciting. We're actually going to plant this one in a 5-inch plastic container. It has a lot of drainage holes again, and you may be thinking, isn't that too big for a plant this size, as well as with that kind of root system? Yes, it may be, but the reason why I actually want to plant it in this 5-inch container is because we are going to add a moss plank, because these guys love to climb, and the more they climb, the bigger the leaves get. And this is a juvenile plant, so eventually when these guys mature, they'll develop fenestration or holes similar to like a Monstera Deliciosa. So that is why we want to do that. So I have my moss plank here that I made, and I did do a video on how to make moss poles or moss planks, pretty much the same method. So we are gonna plant this guy with the plastic container, similar to this, and then we're gonna plant the Siltepecana in there, and then we're gonna get this guy to climb up. So that is the reason why I'm actually planting it in this 5-inch container, because we do need a bit more weight to hold this guy up, and this aroid mixture is perfect for that. Again, because of this aroid mixture, how airy it is, I'm not concerned that this pot is a little too big or that there's too much of this potting mixture relative to the root system, because like I said, these guys grow really fast and this mixture is quite airy. So that's the most important thing when it comes to transferring a lot of your cuttings from either water or sphagnum moss, is to make sure that the mixture you are using is still airy, so that way the water can flow nicely through, and you can still kind of water this quite heavily and not worry so much about experiencing some root rot. So we're gonna go ahead and place this guy where we want it, and I think I'm gonna do it right about there, just above, and then start adding our aroid mix here. There you guys have it. So we now potted our Siltepecana, and then what I want to do is water this guy actually thoroughly, and you guys can see here, once I'm watering it, you can see how well the water drains through because of this aroid mix. It's pretty amazing, and like I said, that is the most important thing when you are transferring any plant cuttings from water, especially if they've been sitting in water or sphagnum moss for a while, is to make sure that the potting mixture you're going to use is really airy until you can kind of get used to, kind of a natural natural watering cycle or habitat, because you may need to water this one frequently just to kind of get used to it, and this aroid mix dries up pretty well. So yeah, so there is our Steeltypicana. I think what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna mist the moss plank, so that way these guys can start latching on, their aerial roots can start latching onto the moss plank and then eventually kind of grow up. So I'm excited for this one. This is honestly becoming one of my favorite plants right now. So yeah, really, really exciting. All right guys, so the next plant we're going to be potting up is our Monstera Albo cutting. And I got this guy earlier in the spring, and when I did receive this one, it was actually potted in sphagnum moss, and that's where it was originally rooting, this cutting. However, I knocked off this new growth. It was a new nub that was showing up. I chipped it and it looked like it was rotting. So I was so afraid of it, because it's an Albo, that I decided to actually remove it from the sphagnum moss and put it in water. And the reason being is because all the Monstera cuttings I've had in the past, I've always rooted it in water, and that's where I was more comfortable with. So I wanted to be able to see the roots, making sure that they were growing, and just to keep an eye on this plant. So that is why I moved it in water. You know, I debated back and forth, but after allowing it to calm down, chill, relax, it began to develop these beautiful new roots. You guys can see all that white roots there. Those are new roots. And then it started to obviously grow this new leaf that you guys see right now, plus an aerial root that you see down there. So I was so happy and excited to obviously see this guy thrive again. And you know, I thought I was gonna kill this plant. So I was actually going to wait till we get a second leaf before I transfer this into an aroid mix. But you know, we are heading into the fall and the winter season. I really don't want this one to be sitting in water through the winter season. That's because, again, the longer you have them in water, the more they'll get used to it, and the more tricky it'll be to kind of transfer them over to a potting mixture when you do decide to eventually do it, right? So let's go ahead and start potting this guy up. Again, we're gonna use this aroid mix. I'm gonna use a 6-inch container. I was gonna go slightly bigger, but considering we're into, you know, the fall winter season, the growth rate of your plants tend to get a little bit slower. So I don't anticipate this one to grow that big or massive, so it should be fine in the 6-inch container. So we're gonna put a little layer here of our aroid mix and then place this cutting. You wanna make sure it's the right height. Yeah, this looks good right there. That looks good. Look at that, man. I'm so happy. Oh man, I remember I was freaking out about this plant when I thought this new growth was gonna die. And actually, this new leaf is probably the second leaf, because you can see that it's coming out of the shell. I don't know if you guys can see it really close, but that was originally the first leaf that I knocked off. It didn't grow into a leaf, it just kind of grew the bottom or main stem, and then that part got pregnant, which obviously it became this leaf. So if I would have never knocked that down, it probably would have gave me like 2 beautiful leaves right now, but whatever. Sometimes things happen with your plants, right? So let's go ahead and shake this up. The other thing about using these plastic container is I can see if the roots are starting to wrap around or develop. So that's another reason why I did like this plastic container when I did find it at my local garden center. But yeah, okay. So here is our cutting. It's a bit heavy. This guy is starting to pull it down. So I think what I want to do, shake it up a bit just to make sure it doesn't pull. Okay, we're gonna try this one more time. Sometimes, you know, it takes a few tries for you to get it to the right spot, because what I'm realizing is the higher this guy sits, the heavier this leaf is, and it's starting to pull it down, and I don't want to snap the roots off. So we're gonna plant this guy a little bit deeper. It was a little high, so let's try again one more time. All right guys, so here is our Monstera Albo. We figured out the right positioning to be placed in this container, use our aroid mix, and really the next step here is similar to the Siltepecana, is we water this one really well, watch that water drain through, place these guys in an area that gets a lot of bright indirect light, and pretty much care for it like you normally would care these plants. Whenever the soil or the mixture you have them in starts to feel dry or the leaves start to feel droopy, water it really, really well, watch that water drain through, and then place it back in its location. I'm gonna have a couple of these under a grow light just to extend the daylight time. These guys were used to having at least 12 hours of daylight during the summer. We're heading into the fall, the winter season. Daylight becomes a little shorter, so I do use a bit of a grow light to really kind of just give this guy a bit of a help, especially, you know, considering that they are still cuttings and they're not as mature yet. So I do want to make sure they get a lot of light so that way they can continue to thrive, grow this winter season, and then come spring, really take off. But yeah, other than that, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, learned something new. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.